Yeah, so those Gent Corporation boys are kind of strange. Every time I come back to work, they put in even more of their pointless gadgets. Now, last week, they built some kind of, I don't know, a
Oh boy, it's the funny video game number. Hello, bones and ghouls, and welcome back to Halloween in July. Speaking of 0451, this year's apron is great for cooking, stacking boxes, and playing oddly contrived hacking mini-games. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In case you're new here, every summer I pick out a collection of spooky games to show you, and we slash the yearly rate on the Patreon as low as it'll go. And to further sweeten the deal, on top of a year's worth of early videos, Discord access, and all the recipes for cooking segments and 4K cat clips I can send you, any yearly pledge gets one of these sweet iron-on patches I make myself as a free thank you. And any yearly pledge at the $5 recipe tier or higher gets their own patron apron, just like the one I use on cooking segments, for free. Now, to get you up to speed for this year, we're going over some of the most prolific installments in the niche known as mascot horror with one all-important twist. We are approaching them with something called the beginner's mindset. That means we're going into these games with no preconceptions and as little outside info as possible. No massive amounts of background lore from secondary sources, no acknowledging tropes or stereotypes within the niche, good or bad, when we are directly talking about the game, and we are judging these games solely by what we experience inside of them. Today, for the celebration of Spookies, we're going to do Bendy and the Dark Revival. Now, we previously did Bendy and the Ink Machine, and I enjoyed it quite a bit, so my hopes are set high for the Dark Revival. Bendy and the Dark Revival has us entering the world within the Ink Machine once more to find that everything's different now, but perhaps it's actually the same. Welcome back to the Ink Machine. Things have gotten spicier since you were last here. The new player character, Audrey, no relation to nerdy botanist or sadistic dentist, finds herself thrown into a version of the Ink Machine that is a lot more developed, with a lot more developed seekers who mean business. She's not going to be able to just run like hell and mash left click to bonk them out of existence right out of the gate. Audrey's going to need to carefully avoid seekers and members of the Butcher Gang early on, since she has no means to immediately defend herself. When you do finally get your hands on a gent pipe, you're going to need to pick your battles carefully. Enemies respawn, and most early fights are resource intensive enough that you can't doomslayer your way through the animation department. Stealth is going to be pretty important throughout the game, and it's a well fleshed out system. On top of all the little hidey holes the last game had, there's proper crouching, good line of sight, and sound propagation rules for enemies, and after playing some games in this little adventure, I can really appreciate that. Also, certain areas will have walls you can destroy to allow yourself to make a quick escape. And later on, you're going to get a blink ability, which is always a welcome addition to any sneak 'em up. What's even better than that is you also get a stealth takedown, which means that if you know what you're doing, you can use the blink and the stealth takedown to clear entire rooms without anyone seeing you. What sweetens the pot on that last part is that the stealth kill heals you, and you might have gotten drops otherwise, but it's a really meaty chunk of your HP you get back. There's other drops you'll need to get from either exploration or taking out enemies a good old-fashioned way, but before we get into that, let's touch on some good old-fashioned violence. Once you're comfortable with the gent pipe, you can reasonably take on whole groups of enemies with it, and it's a fairly consistent way to start racking up money and crafting materials. Crafting materials aren't just for crafting, but also for unlocking safes in world, which have some really useful stuff in them. If you're in the zone, the blink goes from a way to narrowly avoid detection to a good way to close distance or outright zip to just behind enemies to avoid their attacks while getting a few free hits for yourself. Another new thing in the Ink Machine is that you now have upgrades for both your weapons and yourself. For weapons, there'll be little upgrade stations scattered across the game that let you add widgets both story necessary and violence optimizing to your gent pipe. And for Audrey, she sticks her hand into the jars of extra spicy ink to get a stat boost. The extra spicy ink is hidden all over the game world and gives you a good reason to explore. You can actually run all the way back to the very beginning of the Ink Machine for most of the game if you want to be thorough in your power-up hunting, and it's not going to be an exercise in futility if you don't find a jar of ink, because crafting materials and other pickups will respawn after a while. Not too shabby, as the gent pipe upgrades are quite the parts sink. You only really need the first gent pipe upgrade, as that allows you to open certain doors with it, but the other two are both really good. I was only able to find the schematics for the shock pipe, which gives you a big damage boost, but after I finished the game and checked walkthroughs out of curiosity, it seems that the third and final upgrade, the stun pipe, basically lets you ignore almost all stealth situations with the sheer power of your violence. Nice. And of course, there's some puzzling and code hunting going on. If you're wondering why I got such a kick out of the first code, I'm going to take the opportunity to tell you about it since it's not often I'm out of my ImSim wheelhouse and the mascot horror crowd might not know about 0451. The Meatly is a pretty big fan of BioShock, and the first door code in that is 0451. But that's not where the code comes from. 451 comes from the ancestor of BioShock, a game that came out over a decade before it called System Shock. It got a pretty good remake last year, but the original game has also gotten a facelift to run on modern systems. They're both really good, and if you're interested, I've made videos on both of them. Game creator and father of the immersive sim, Warren Spector, was looking for something to use as the first code you need to find in-game and settled for the door code for Origin Systems Office, 451. Oddly enough, no actual relationship to the Ray Bradbury novel. System Shock wasn't the first immersive sim and also predates the use of the term, but it's arguably the first immersive sim that really took off. When Ken Levine, who would later go on to create BioShock, took over development in System Shock 2, his studio, Irrational Games, used code 0451 as the first code in that game too. Some variant of 451 has become the calling card for all games that followed the immersive sim creed. The Deus Ex series, System Shock successor series, BioShock, Dishonored, Typhon aka the other game called Prey that wasn't even supposed to be called Prey, and more. Even if some of the games that use it aren't really considered immersive sims, with the ImSim status of the original BioShock being especially contentious, it's seen as an homage to the ImSim lineage to have the code in the game, even if it's not an actual functioning door code. For instance, Deathloop, a sort of greatest hits of ImSim mechanics put out by Arcane a couple years ago, doesn't have the code anywhere in the game, but you get a special line of dialogue and an achievement for putting it into the first door code you come across. Bendy and the Dark Revival is just one of the latest in a long line of games paying tribute to System Shock. Now, where were we? Oh right, the puzzles. There's also plenty of puzzles that, while aren't going to be brain scorchers, are still fun to do. I particularly like this one where you had to line up the keyframes from an animation with Bendy in it. There's also some things that give you a reason to backtrack beyond just hunting for crafting supplies, such as finding a snack for this big fella here or doing a grocery run. Don't worry, you also get fast travel later in the game, so this isn't terrible. Time for the spookies. The main spookies in the Dark Revival are now smarter and also have some vocal callouts which make for a more intense experience. Having the seekers be more active makes it more of a gamble to go into a new area or even return to older ones because they might just be there, and there might be half a dozen, and this time they look for you. You can still run into a confession booth or other hidey hole if you want to disengage, but that doesn't solve the problem of them all being there. The Butcher Gang still shows up too, but they're not as present later in the game, at least not the original 3. The Dark Revival also introduces the Keepers, who care not for your stealth takedowns and generally must be avoided at all costs. There's other freaky stuff, like how on top of the low color setting the previous game had, there are now some areas in a pretty extreme state of disrepair and it's kind of a mess. And then you remember that ink is also the body and blood of all the entities living here. And then there's Wilson. We'll talk about him later though. The game's got some pretty good scares that I'm hesitant to talk about since knowing about them can dampen the effect. Now, I'll preface this by saying something that some of you have noticed about me. Years of playing spooky games has given me a pretty strong resistance to traditional scares in video games. But I'll say that while there were plenty of good scares, there was nothing really that scared me silly. And I say that as a guy who, the last game that really scared me was Cry of Fear. That's free on Steam, by the way, but be warned, it is not for the faint of heart. Unfortunately, there are also some pretty cheap, outright bad scares in the Dark Revival too. I said that we don't see much of the original 3 members of the Butcher Gang in the Dark Revival, but that's because there's a 4th member now. This Ghost Girl. What does Ghost Girl do? She literally appears out of nowhere and screams at microphone peaking levels with no notice or buildup. As far as I can tell, it just happens randomly. Now you can dodge her if you're fast enough, but on top of being a cheap jump scare, she's essentially a damage tax. If you want to avoid her, you've got to be really dialed into the game, but if you're that dialed into the game, you're also going to get jumped by the loud scream. I couldn't figure out much about Ghost Girl's AI, but as far as I can tell, Joey Drew was kind enough to make sure that she doesn't appear anywhere near major story events. And it wouldn't be a Bendy game without the Ink Demon. The Ink Demon's not only got a new and much spookier look, but is also much more talkative this time around. One of the major premises in the story is that Wilson here alleges to all of the Ink Machine that he killed the Ink Demon, but that is certainly not the case when you arrive there. This time around, the Ink Demon's approach is a little more obvious, and you aren't given nearly as much time to run and hide. If I had to guess, I think this is more to do with speeding things along, as overall, Ink Demon's encounters are much faster than they were in Bendy in the Ink Machine, as you don't need to wait for him to slowly walk past the confession booth anymore. He just sees that you're gone and gives up. The Ink Demon's relationship with the player is much more antagonistic this time around, as much of him is talking to you in a mocking way, mocking Audrey's attempts to get out of the Ink Machine, or otherwise just overtly threatening her. Even when an Ink Demon encounter isn't coming, he's ever present, as one of the lines Seekers will frequently say is they keep seeing him despite Wilson's claims. While you won't learn the true nature of your relationship to the Ink Demon until much later in the game, he seems to know much more than he's letting on, and also much more about you than you know about yourself. Okay, time for a cooking segment. We already did bacon soup the last time we played a Bendy game, so where do we go from here? Well, the only thing better than soup is soup in a bread bowl. I totally botched this though. As some of you know, I have a personal rule where I do not use any kitchen tools that cost more than $50, as cooking should be for everyone, so I'm not going to be filming myself using big pricey tools and therefore exclude people who cannot afford big pricey tools. Normally when I bake my bread, I use a stand mixer, but for this I tried my hand at hand kneading. It didn't go well. Rather than scrap this though, we're going to use this as a lesson in how things can just go wrong when you're making bread sometimes. First step in baking some bread is to get your yeast going. That means warming up some water just a little, mixing in your yeast and some sugar for its breakfast, and then lightly covering it for about 5 minutes to let it wake up and get foamy. My first yeast packet did not do that, and that's totally normal by the way. Sometimes yeast is just dead on arrival, which is why even in the smallest quantities you can buy it, yeast is sold 3 packets at a time. I dump it all out and start over with another packet, and while it doesn't foam up as much as it usually does, that's good enough for now. Now let's get back to what I was doing before I was waiting for all this yeast to wake up. While the yeast is rising is a great time to mix all your other ingredients and have them ready, starting with the dry stuff. Sift your flour into a large mixing bowl and then add the salt. Now take a sec to soften up your butter by zapping it for no more than 30 seconds in the microwave, unless you want to be cleaning the interior of that thing. Add in your near melted butter, some more water since we want a high moisture bread, and then eventually your awakened yeast. Now before you get to the kneading, take a sec to use a wooden spoon or other non-stick utensil to lightly mix the ingredients so that when you turn it out to work it, it doesn't just go splat all over your counter. Now comes the part where things go off the rails for me. I turn out my dough onto a not so lightly floured surface and start to knead. Now if I had to guess what went wrong here, it'd be that I either overfloured the surface or I did not have enough water in my dough. The end result was, rather than getting something that's only slightly firm and supple enough to where if you poked it, the dough springs back, I got something that was really firm and just outright resistant to poking. We're not quitters though, so we let this rise in a sprayed down and covered bowl for 1 hour, and then we're gonna shape it. Okay, that's some rise. Let's get it shaped. Now I'm going to tell you now that the technique for getting round loaves for a bread bowl is the one that I did last year. Don't focus on the final shape of what you want, but instead gently shape the dough into a ball and then lightly press it down onto a sprayed down sheet of parchment paper for its second rise. Let your second rise do all the bread bowl shaping. We're going to let this chill for another hour before we start the baking process. Baking time. Now we initially only let this second rise happen for 1 hour, but the rolls are going to get another 30 minutes as we fill a full-size tray with water after we put it into the bottom rack of the oven, and then when it's full, we're going to start preheating the oven to 400 or so degrees, giving the oven at least 30 minutes to start really steaming up. Toss those rolls into the top rack for half an hour, and maybe more depending on your oven, since ovens are funny things with no two being the same, and then just hope for the best. I have no idea how the whole oven thing works, but like, ovens are weird like that. Once your timer goes off, remove the loaves from the oven and then immediately take them off your tray and place onto a wire rack to cool. Now these are going to need at least 30 minutes before you can cut into them, because like all things that are baked, bread needs to cool down and rest too. Once that time has passed, go ahead and carefully carve out the bowl part of your bread bowl, and hey, look at that! These abominations actually hold soup. Kind of. Now, I was feeling pretty bad about this particular batch, so I went back and tried again a week later when I was doing my weekly bread bake where I make the sandwich rolls for my wife's lunches. Literally, the only difference between these much better rolls you see here and the previous botched attempt was that I was using the stand mixer with a dough hook attached on the lowest setting for a little over 5 minutes. Unfortunately, by the time I remade them, I was all out of soup. I'll give you two things here to help those of you that aren't exactly in the position to buy an appliance where the cheapest of the name brand costs $400. For one, you don't have to buy a big fancy KitchenAid. If you're just starting out, there's a few less than prestigious name brand stand mixers on Big Bezos' Billionaire Bazaar for less than 100 smackaroos. And if you don't like the idea of giving money to the bald baron, there's always schlepping it through the Goodwill, Salvation Armies, and other thrift shops in your area where you can often find old beat up ones for $20. Or, if you just don't have the counter space, you can learn how to properly knead dough unlike me. King Arthur Flour has plenty of decent tutorials on all things bread. I'll link their channel down below. I know you've all seen my sandwiches before and have asked me about my bread recipe, and well, here it is. For the not botched bread bowls, I used my normal recipe and just portioned out half of the dough different to make large, wide loaves instead of sandwich rolls. As you know, all patrons at the $5 tier or higher at patreon.com/charlatanwonder get full, detailed recipes along with standalone cooking videos. And since it's the season of the Spookies, I've got that special where the yearly rate of patronage is discounted as low as it'll go, and if you pledge at the recipe tier or higher, you get your own apron just like mine as an added gift. Everyone who pledges yearly also gets the cool iron-on anti-content patch. Now let's get back to Bendy. Let's take the time to go over the story and world building. We're not into plot details yet, but they're coming up in a bit, so be ready. Before we get into those though, Bendy and the Dark Revival has a great sense of humor. Now, I'm not gonna overtly show you the funny moments because the only thing that depreciates faster than scares on subsequent viewings are jokes. But I hope that you can take my word that the game has plenty of moments of levity in it, with a few gags that got me to audibly laugh out loud. This does the Dark Revival plenty of favors because while we're not viewing these individual games with preconceptions as Halloween of July, I can mention that it is a known issue among some mascot horror games and even other emerging genres of horror like analog horror that they take themselves way too seriously and end up having moments where the audience ends up laughing at them, not with them. This isn't really a new thing though, especially for internet-based horror. We've all memed on ultra-realistic blood appearing on the narrator's television or game screen in a creepypasta. And of course, there's lots of callbacks to the first game and even more BioShock references. We're not going to get too into the callbacks, at least not immediately, because a lot of them are plot related. Now, I remember when I first saw some teasers for this game floating around social media, and people were quick to point out that Audrey resembled Elizabeth a bit, but we were off the mark there. Once we got the whole player model, we could see that she was straight up wearing a half-sleeve variant of Jack's sweater from the original BioShock. There's a whole lot of little things like the inkwells you revive out of being reminiscent of the pipes little sisters came out of, and the game is very art deco when you get into the city proper. In case you missed the last video, we went over how the rubber hose style of animation Bendy uses and the art deco aesthetic of BioShock were things that happened concurrently in the early 20th century. And then we've got the 451 reference in all those vials of spicy ink that very much remind me of infusions in BioShock Infinite. It's nothing too overt or crazy, but there's plenty to remind you that, oh yeah, the Meatly loves BioShock. Personally, I've got no issues with Joey Drew the game studio taking their inspirations from BioShock because for one, I love BioShock and it's clear to me that they love and respect it too. And for another, I'm enjoying watching Joey Drew Studios grow as a game developer. And as they get more comfortable and add in more complex game mechanics, I'm also pleased that they seem to know better than to try and climb into the bottomless pit of scope creep known as trying to make an indie immersive sim. You didn't get to see a lot of the big players in immersive sim rise to power because by the time Ken Levine made BioShock, he already had made his bones helping with the initial design of Thief and then heading up System Shock 2 alongside of Looking Glass, which it's funny how that worked because it was like two concurrent teams of Looking Glass and the fledgling Irrational, but that's a bit of a sidetracking thing here. Then we've got Rafael Colantonio of Arcane and now Wolfeye, who was originally part of EA's French localization team, and Arcane's founding was in protest to EA screwing over Origin Systems. Arx Fatalis still remains is the closest and best spiritual successor to the original immersive sim, Ultima Underworld. Maybe the Meatly and Joey Drew Studios will eventually try to make a full-blown immersive sim or something close to it, but for now, I'm perfectly fine watching them steadily improve game to game, regardless of where they're taking their inspiration from. Okay, plot time. This is spoilers. You know what to do if you don't want them. So Audrey works in an animation studio where she draws Bendy, which is oddly enough not Joey Drew Studios. After a few references to the working conditions in animation, Audrey helps the handyman Wilson with fixing up the Bendy Museum, and I don't want to make any judgments or anything because maybe this guy's just got asthma and he's led a hard life, and he forcibly shoves us into the ink machine. This all seems very familiar, but very different. Wilson also seems to be the de facto leader of the world within the ink machine, casting himself as a literal hero who killed the ink demon. Except of course the ink demon is clearly out and about. Also, hey look, it's Bendy. Our little man's got a new look. We do have some friendly faces around to help us, like Allison, who helps us get our bearings in the ink machine, and while I know this guy's got a canon name, I just call him Mr. Pipe. Most of the time, Audrey is left to her own devices and just trying to find a way out of the ink machine and an answer to why she looks so messed up now that she's inside of it. Also, the ink is whispering to her, which, that can't be good. Most of this is boiling down to, I need to get out of here because the ink demon is around, and he seems to want something from Audrey. Eventually, Joey Drew himself appears out of nowhere to give a bit of explanation and also some closure for the previous game. After Henry Stein left Joey Drew Studios, Joey Drew got a little buck wild with his machinations within the ink machine, which included making a clone of Henry to eternally torment, which explains why as soon as Bendy and the ink machine's Henry open the door to leave Joey's home, he finds himself right back in the old animation studio. Eventually, Joey Drew realized that this was pretty weird to do and wanted to make something more constructive, so he made Audrey, who is the closest thing to a child he has. Yeah, Audrey is a lot more similar to Jack than she is Elizabeth. Audrey, being at least part human, she was able to leave the ink machine and live a somewhat normal life, but nothing ever goes well in games like this, so of course an eccentric industrialist bought out the IP rights to Bendy because he felt like being an animator. Wilson, who is that industrialist's son, discovers the ink machine and realizes what it is. Wilson's been playing God in the ink machine and Audrey needs to find a way to stop it. As it turns out, showing the ink demon the end film reel doesn't actually stop the world of the ink machine, it just resets it. At some point, Wilson was able to find and capture Henry Stein and create the keepers to keep anyone else from showing the ink demon the end, thus negating the cycle from being reset and allowing them to build the ink machine into a society that he and his keepers control. Also, the reason why Joey Drew can't do anything about this is because that's not the real Joey Drew. He's actually like an ink clone of himself that is subject to the same rules as everything else in the ink machine. Audrey finds her way to the Keeper's Fortress, and it's basically an SCP facility for any entity that could possibly reset or break the cycle. This includes a few fan favorites from the previous games such as Sammy, a concerningly empty containment cell, and most importantly, Henry Stein, who is able to explain how to break the cycle to Audrey. Audrey gets past all the Keepers and into Wilson's sanctum, and Wilson is surprisingly chill with just having Audrey as a house guest for a bit, and while it's a little concerning how much he wants us to take a sleeping draft, we don't have time to worry about this because Alice Angel broke containment and she is definitely a Keter class thing to be contained. Don't worry, we deal with this. Finally, we learn everyone's endgame. It turns out that Wilson can't truly kill the ink demon, only temporarily force him into his Bendy form, and then the Keepers can only keep him contained for so long before he reverts. He's been using all of his resources in the ink machine to build a new apex predator for the world within the ink machine because someone clearly did not see how that went over in Godzilla vs. Kong. It's a color cartoon character. Wilson's hoping this new character will be more than strong enough to permanently deal with the ink demon, but also remain completely under control, since it's been a while since the ink demon was first made, and now he and the Keepers have a better understanding on how to create entities out of the ink. He just needs one last component to bring it to life: Audrey. This does not go well for him. Turns out Audrey's the ink demon's endgame too. If he merges with her, he'd be powerful enough to rule the ink machine without limitation. Small problem for him though. Audrey's not just gonna let him do that. Audrey actually manages to gain control of the ink demon through the Inky Fusion dance when, with the help of literally everyone, she's able to pilot him like an EVA unit right into the projector, showing the end. Audrey finally escapes the ink machine, but now she has a greater understanding of the power she possesses, being made of both flesh and ink. The end. Final thoughts on Bendy the Dark Revival. Hell yeah! It's got some pretty engaging gameplay, it is a steal for a small studio game, it is a great story, and it isn't afraid to laugh at itself, which is very important. It's definitely one of the better, if not the best mascot horror games I've played so far, and at this point I am excited to see what Bendy the Cage has to offer when it comes out. Heck, I'll probably even watch the Bendy movie because why not? I definitely recommend this one too, as it's a nice little game and you can do a whole lot worse for your money. Now before we go, don't forget that we're still doing Halloween in July, which means that my yearly rate for the Patreon is discounted as low as it'll allow me to discount it, and that anyone who pledges yearly, on top of getting all the cool benefits such as Discord access, early videos, and cooking recipes, gets a free Iron-On anti-content patch, and then anyone who pledges at the $5 recipe tier or higher gets their own patron apron as a free gift. I do literally make all this stuff by hand, by the way. This promo runs for as long as Halloween in July does, so let's sign off. Remember that no matter what you do, be it traditional animation, car modification, painting miniatures, or whatever your passion might be, what you do should never be called content. What you do is art. Content is a word that has been twisted into meaning a way to grind up all your passions, skills, and hopes into a gray sludge that's meant for nothing more than the mindless consumption to make a line go up. Your art in no way deserves that. Your art is a reflection of you by the very nature of its creation, and you in no way deserve that. So get out there and fight against the contentification of everything. It's the best way to fight for yourself. Stay saucy, everyone. Oh, saucy boy. You inspecting all the aprons we made? Well, I made. But you're on them, so you kind of helped. Oh, you rubbing up against the backpack that has like the last few batches I need to get done? He doesn't care. He's like, why did you stop petting me? Oh, you rubbing up against cardboard? You getting pets? You are just having the best morning. Look at you. Look at how vibrant your fur is. What a spry, healthy lad. Can I scritch chin? Ooh, I can scritch chin. He's probably letting me do all this because I just came back from like the gym and he's like, oh, no one was here for like 2 hours. Why did you leave? You know what, I'm just gonna let you go to town on that backpack. And I gotta get back to work. You have fun.